like at right about that mosquito. They were like this entire yay nay, and there were two people on board. There's a news story about it. Everyone was laughing. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, somewhere I think it was like Littleton, New Hampshire, had mosquito control. Yep, two of them going. Okay. That's all right.
He's okay.
So I've
Hey, everybody. We're going to go ahead and call this meeting to order at 6:04. Today is May 28th, 2019, and we're going to go ahead and start with roll call. Jonna, do you want to start?
Jonna Flood.
Ben Lowe.
Jordan Tate.
Brianna LaRose.
Sam Boss. Tony Bollier.
Thank you very much. So we'll go ahead and approve the April minutes, which were attached in the email. So if you want to provide any feedback on that. I didn't have the guests listed because I have to track down what I did with the guest sheet sign-in.
It was very, very lengthy too. So.
Yes, yeah, I might have to watch the video back and try and get the names, but so that's the only other thing that I would say is that I have to add in the guests. Any other feedback on the April minutes? Anyone want a motion?
I will motion to approve the April 16th minutes.
Second.
All in favor? Thank you. Okay, so we don't have any public as of yet, so we'll just move along. So work completed. I've been reappointed to the Conservation Commission with a term expiration date. I believe it's June 1st, 2022. We have a new member, Sam. Thank you for joining the Conservation Commission. What is your term expiration date?
I believe 2022.
Okay.
3 years.
Gotcha. And we will be also losing a member. Ben, this is your last meeting. Thank you for all the work you've done on the Conservation Commission.
We're going to miss you.
We'll miss you a lot.
It's been a pleasure.
Well, we know where to find you, so maybe we'll have to have an impromptu meeting there.
That would be great.
And just to add to that, this will also be my last meeting.
Oh, Will?
Yes.
Okay. Have you notified Sue?
I have not. I didn't renew my membership, but I can let her know.
Okay.
I'll email her. I can CC you.
Right. We will miss you also. In that case, if it's your last meeting, I'll take care of the minutes
Okay.
for tonight. So. Any other work completed since the last meeting that we need to update on?
Well, I attended the conference in Brunswick. This year's topic, because every year we have a big topic. This year was more of the environmental impact of global change, and we talked a lot about invasive species and the travel of invasive species, and also some non-native animals and plants and how they've kind of moved their way up New England, mostly because we're having much warmer seasons overall. And they're anticipating certain travels of certain animals. Like we talked a little bit about lobsters and how maybe lobsters aren't really as threatened in those fisheries as we think they are, and they're just traveling up north to Canada.
Okay.
Some of the birds that they've lost in the southern part have actually been migrating, and they're flourishing up here.
So it's a little uplifting then.
Yeah, and there was a lot of really nice maps and stuff, and I'll share those with the group. We got some contacts. The inland wildlife and fishery lady is also the main representative now for the provinces of all of Canada and Maine for this invasive species group that they've got going. So she's been working very hard on that. That's all kind of new to her.
Perfect. Well, any notes you have or materials from the meeting that you'd like me to include in the minutes for this meeting?
Yep.
Go ahead and send that to me and I'll include that. Any other work completed? All right, we'll go ahead and move on. Work in progress, Parks Subcommittee. I don't have an update from Tiz on that. She's been out. I don't think they're very active at the moment, so we'll skip over that.
I want to say they're mostly focused on the cemeteries right now.
I think
Parks
so. I
is
know
kind
that
of
they
on a
wanted to get
sabbatical.
I know they wanted to get the flags up for Memorial Weekend for all the veterans' graves. So I did see plenty of those. So it looks like they accomplished their goal for that. We had Arbor Week for the Lewiston Auburn Community Forest Board from what was last week, May 20th to the 24th. I believe I saw a picture of you at the tree planting.
We did. We planted a beautiful little sugar maple over at Pettingale in Auburn. And we had the mayor show up. Peter had conflicting agendas, so he wasn't able to. And Gary was there also from Forest Board. Rick had dual appointments, and we were chasing from Auburn to Lewiston, obviously. Kind of made a guest appearance, but you missed him in the.
Oh, no.
Then we ran over to Lewiston, and we planted some trees over in their Pettingale. So we did a magnolia over there and a little ginkgo too. Pretty successful all around. I know the city planted a lot of trees, weeks, placing some of the dead ones. And then our little tree farm, we're kind of getting ready to do a harvest probably soon, but
Really?
it's wet out. So if you haven't.
Oh, good enough.
It's cute. It's very wet, so Steve's been working a lot of. Successful week. Banners all over.
That sounds good.
We're recognized. Rick went to Camden, and Lewiston and Auburn are recognized for 16 years of Tree City, USA. And yeah,
Should we get a plaque for that we'll hang?
we got banners, and we've got our poster boards, which I think are still in the first floor of this building downstairs. I brought the new one over.
Perfect. Thank you.
And I actually was present for the last city council meeting to speak on recycling, and they gave me a proclamation to give to the Conservation Commission on Arbor Day. So have an official city recognition and provide
Perfect.
for the record.
Yes,
There we
thank
go.
you. I'd love to include that somewhere, either if it's in these May minutes or somewhere on our city webpage. So if you can send the proclamation to me, I'll definitely promote that and maybe see if we can get Liz to do some promotion on all of the Arbor Week festivities that happen. Okay,
We could add all that.
for our
Six.
annual report, yeah,
Yeah.
which is on the new business, so we'll get back to that. Make a side note. So before we dive into the Agriculture Resource Protection Zone ordinance, is there anything to update on LA Trails or Mount Appetite group?
On LA Trails, the new group that has been forming that I've mentioned previously is meeting, and I can't remember now if it's this week or next week. But I would urge this now that I'm leaving to have somebody else take over representing the commission for Trails in Auburn. I'm happy to forward the.
If you want to just forward it to the auburn.me.conservation email, I'll just at least have that, and then whoever we assign as liaison, I'll forward that to them. Thank you.
I know the difficulty with that is the timing of the meeting. It's less work. So we've kind of discussed that. But yeah,
When do those meetings take place?
they rotate from Lewiston City Hall to Auburn City Hall. The last meeting we had here, they're starting at 4:00.
The last email I got from the group was actually a survey about times and places, so they're willing to make it work to the extent possible, knowing that you accommodate every.
Right.
And the least we can do is to include them as an ongoing update, make sure that we have minutes in there. And we've been developing a relationship with, the Androscoggin Land Trust, and though it's not necessarily their program anymore, I think it will be helpful to at least associate with the members of LA Trails and try and just have communication if we can't establish a formal liaison. But we'll do our best. Hopefully we can get some meetings in. All right, with that said, are there any other subcommittee updates or work in progress updates that I have missed?
Well, the Mount Appetite group too, which is separate.
Oh, yes.
So the Mount Appetite group, which unfortunately is meeting tonight
Mhm.
at 6:30 in the other room, but our last month's meeting was very successful. We did a lot of brainstorming on raising funds. We're working on those trails. We've got signage already up and going. We've developed a Facebook group, which is the Friends of Mount Appetite, and it's now public, so anybody can go on there and comment. We're also talking about trails. Officially, Trails National Day is June 1st, and what we wanted to do was get that first kiosk up. And we also wanted to build a time capsule, so that was tonight's meeting that they're going to discuss. We've also started brainstorming and developing a logo for the Mount Appetite, Friends of Mount Appetite. So we've gone through the first process. We had several, I believe Liz, Allen, and Sabrina were working on that. We all kind of gave our feedback. So tonight they're going to come back with more logos.
Is
So,
this
yeah.
an independent group or is it within
Now
the
it
city?
is, and it's falling under the Recs department, so it's kind of weird because it's sort of one of our subcommittees and one of LA Trails subcommittees, but because it's new, we're still trying to find our way. Part of LA Trails is that ALT is going to try to release them. They want to sit on LA Trails and be a member of that, but not have that completely under their umbrella because ALT is really looking at all of it. And LA Trails is really trying to just focus.
Okay.
So that's kind of where they stand. And then in the middle of all of this, the Mount Appetite group has formed. So we're not sure where that plays.
Okay, well, we'll just keep track
Um,
of
Yeah.
how it progresses, and then whatever way the Conservation Commission needs to play a role, we can
And
discuss
help
that moving
support
forward.
that, right?
Okay. Any others? Updates, working in progress? All right. Well, we know the bulk of our meeting is going to be discussing more detailed feedback on the draft Agriculture and Resource Protection Ordinance. The most recent update that we had been working on was the February 11th version. So I guess I'll start off. I think we should discuss the ordinance and then we can discuss the definitions. We'll account for work that's been done by the planning board as they're also in this process. We have, I have some notes from the meeting minutes on May 14th. Tiz is unable to be here. She is out of town. She had, an excused absence, but she did provide feedback. It was kind of summarize what we've been discussing the past couple months, that her specific feedback was that the changes to the zone are too broad and they'll result in pretty significant consequences, that the recommendations from the Crossroads study need to be taken more directly into account before we change the ordinance. And that was the gist of it. I don't want to speak too much on her behalf. I can send around her feedback to the commission members, but that was the gist of what she had recommended, is that it was too broad and we need to follow the Crossroads study recommendations before changing the ordinance. So I will open up the discussion to everyone. I'd like to try and move through the ordinance chronologically, I guess, instead of jumping around too much. So if we all just want to kind of start on the purpose, if we think that's a good strategy to move forward through this meeting.
I think it would be good to read the purpose out loud one more time because the whole purpose of the ordinance should follow that
Okay.
paragraph.
Sure. I can go ahead and read the purpose. The purpose of this district are to allow for conservation of natural resources and open space land, and to encourage agricultural, forestry, and certain types of recreational uses. It is declared to be in public interest that these areas should be protected and conserved because of their natural, aesthetic, and scenic value, the need to retain and preserve open space lands, their economic contribution to the city, and primarily because these areas are so remote from existing centers of development that any added uncontrolled growth could result in an economic burden on the city and its inhabitants. This section shall be construed so as to effectuate the purposes outlined here and prevent any attempt to establish uses which are inconsistent with these purposes or any attempt to evade the provisions of this division. So I know in previous meetings we had talked about, we liked the purpose. We felt the purpose was inclusive of both agricultural and natural resource consideration. Was there any other more specific feedback on the purpose that you would like to add?
One thing that strikes me is I like the purpose as outlined, but I think there is an opportunity here to make a stronger case for building the local food economy. And it could be an opportunity to really advocate for that and to integrate language specifically because we have signed on as a city to the Good Food Council's charter, the Good Food Statement, and I have text from that I can refer to, but that was several years ago, and it seems to me that as we discuss this, we should really be thinking about what we can do to really build up food specifically. And I think including some language to that effect here would be a benefit.
Do you think it would be best to have that language be sourced from the Good Food Council agreement or charter that we had signed on to?
Yep.
That way we're making sure we're
Yeah.
consistent with existing language. Thank you for your feedback.
I would also add that preserving clean water is an important part of the ag zone. I think so much of it is in the watershed.
I agree with that, and I guess we can discuss the definitions and the ordinance together. One of the things that I had noticed in the definition is that natural resources nowhere defined, and that leaves it too open to interpretation. So instead of, I think, listing out natural resources separately in the purpose, that they be defined in the definition section and referred to. But making sure that we include drinking water, is that what you said, or groundwater?
Clean water.
Clean water.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else?
I think it's kind of really difficult because I think our task is actually just to look at and review the proposed ordinance and not really rewrite it. I think
Okay.
that's where everybody's getting caught up. Planning board's getting caught up in rewriting it. Some of the subcommittees looking at alternatives, and here we keep just cycling back around. So I totally respect Good Food Council, and I think we could probably do better by doing specific policies and procedures that help support local food versus the ordinance necessarily. I think our task is really to just kind of stick and not get so caught up that
Right.
hours and hours of meetings
I
keep
agree.
cycling back around. So I hate to touch that purpose because
Mhm.
we can give some
Yeah.
feedback. I don't want to rewrite that, and I don't want to add verbiage in there yet. I think that that was their task,
Mhm.
and sending this back with some feedback to City Council is our task. And I don't want to get too hung up, like I said. I don't want to keep revolving.
I
and
think
around.
that makes very good sense. And my inclination to add some language there is more in thinking about, our purpose broadly. I don't necessarily think that needs to be part of a text amendment. I just think as we continue to have these conversations, it would be really good to remember that there's an opportunity to focus on food and not forget that in all this talk about development or preservation, et cetera.
Right.
Keep bringing back the possibility.
Yeah.
Rihanna, how do you feel though about adding a definition of natural resources to the ordinance definitions
Well, in the
page?
definition section, yes, I
Okay.
think there's definitely a lot of room for definition. But again, I don't want to rewrite too much of this.
Right.
I
No,
want to
I
give them
agree that we
feedback,
should
but,
give feedback.
you
and
know,
not-
their role was to try to make a proposed ordinance, and then they're asking kind of our feedback from that proposal.
I completely agree. All right. So moving on, if everyone has contributed their thoughts on the purpose, moving on into the use regulations section. This is a pretty lengthy section, so we can try and go through just any specific feedback that you have in the use section. Use regulation section would be great. So,
But I'd like to just toss out something for just consider keep in the back of our minds. If we think back to the Crossroads study, the Mayor's Ag study, each step along the way, essentially what we've run into is that there has been pressure for time. No single group has had time to really complete their mission. And are we better to continue as process has been suggested, or is it wiser to consider basically taking the current ordinance and then I think most everyone has agreed on maybe the potential of naming an ag resources committee and essentially proposing a suggestion, a recommendation, and then viewing things one at a time, so that basically all interested parties have their attention focused on a single objective, rather than trying to take a shotgun approach to the whole thing, and then we end up with really no one feeling comfortable that they've completed the task.
Where do we stand with that agricultural commission? Because we have some groups working on that, developing and forming that.
I believe a group met recently to deliberate on, what would be the structure of that kind of board. If an ag board is created, what exactly would need to be in place to give it some clout so that it actually, has a real role in these kinds of conversations, and who needs to be on it, how big, et cetera. Some of those questions that are left open-ended. So they met, I believe, last week.
So I guess my question is, if there was going to be a proposed ordinance change with all of this feedback and all of this discussion that we've had, that we would want that committee formed first before we continue all of that.
I don't disagree with any of this. Here's my concern. We submitted 2 letters of concern in December and January with absolutely no response and no regard from any members of City Council, and we got 1 response from the mayor. And in the planning board meeting minutes on May 14th, it says, Mayor Levesque gave a brief history of the original mayor's ad hoc committee. He said most of their recommendations were for the most part vague except one, and then he focuses in on the specific feedback that group gave. My fear is that if we're not providing specific feedback, we're going to get ignored, because it's happened before, and many of the members of the public from this planning board meeting suggested waiting until this agricultural commission group is formed until the ordinance is changed, but we have no way of ensuring that that's going to happen. So I think we need to provide specific feedback on at least the proposed ordinance and say we prefer the changes not to be in effect until the agricultural commission has been put in place. But just given the lack of regard we've been given on our other suggestions and recommendations thus far, I don't want to risk not putting feedback in on what they're proposing. In my opinion.
Yeah, no.
And especially given the fact that, again, in my opinion, not reflective of the entire group, there's been absolutely no discussion on resource protection. And in fact, again, in the meeting minutes, it does say that Mayor Levesque believes it's about turning current agricultural land that's being protected as a resource into agriculture. And I think focusing on the resource protection side of the ordinance, which is in the name, is just being grossly ignored. And I want to make sure that I can provide that feedback in the actual proposed ordinance and make sure that it's not being ignored if we can.
And the meeting minutes that she's referring to are from the planning board, which are drafted and not accepted yet, but it was also
Yes.
taped live, so. And those are referring to our mayor's comments. He was the first to speak, so if you don't have a chance to watch the whole thing, you can watch the beginning.
Yes. So I agree that any recommendations specific to the ordinance we give should be, dependent upon the establishment of an agricultural commission. But I just do want to make sure that we provide specific feedback because I think that's our best chance at it being reviewed and considered.
Do you have any, have you had any feedback as to the time frame that they expect to hear from the Conservation Commission or the Planning Board?
So I did email after our last meeting when we decided that we were going to need more time. I did email the city council and the mayor responded back saying that due to the discussions with the budget, it's okay that we needed more time because that would align with their timeline anyway. So I had given the date of June is the earliest that we could provide, approved specific feedback from our group, and it was my interpretation that that was acceptable based on the mayor's response.
And what date is that June meeting?
Our June meeting is June 18th. That was the earliest possible we could give feedback, but I don't have a firm deadline on when finalized feedback is
I think
required.
we're also waiting for Auburn's legal to review the proposed ordinance too, so I think they needed more time when they responded to this.
Because, I think we should discuss and increase our familiarity with the specifics. But if we don't have basically the email from Sam this afternoon basically gave us planning board minutes, but basically we haven't had an opportunity for input to examine the specifics of that, and we don't have a report from the committee relating to the structure thing, and it seems to me that that's important information that we have to have, or we should have, prior to making a final recommendation. But, preliminary recommendations or for our discussion of that sort of thing and discussing it, it's great. I'm all for, but I really think we have a weakness here that we've got different groups doing different things, and the communication isn't what I wish it was. I think most of our number of our group basically attended the planning board discussion, but sometimes until we actually see the results in black and white, it's hard to really look at it in depth. And so, for that reason, I would hope that we could maybe make our final determination at our June meeting, but make as much progress as possible in the meantime and try to establish links and responsibility on the various groups to basically share information more in a more timely manner.
I think that's a good point, and I think we can definitely move forward discussing the specifics of this ordinance tonight with the understanding that this is preliminary, and I'll put together some kind of version with all of our collective feedback from tonight into something that we can review and potentially approve in June. But yeah, I think we should still move through with the specifics, but maybe on contingent that it's preliminary feedback.
If I could just add one more point. I totally agree with you, Jordan. I think it's important to make sure we take the opportunity when we have it to give feedback on specifics, in part because this commission's feedback has been disregarded. But I also wouldn't want our one of our overarching points, which is that the Ag Commission needs to be formed, to be lost as we get into the weeds of specific language. And I think we need to be really strong on that, because to me that's something that every commission that has looked at this has said is we need to have a strong ag commission that has some clout making these decisions, that can use the information that's come out of all of the studies that have been done. So really emphasizing that point in a very strong way, and foregrounding that and say, this is our main point. Here are some specific concerns that lead us to have this objection and to believe that the only way forward is to have an ag commission that can really give us a better approach.
I like the way that you worded that there, addressing our specific concerns with this ordinance, but ultimately stating that our final feedback would be that this needs to be put on hold, this approval of this ordinance, until an ag commission can be established. So I think that kind of melds the best of both worlds there. Would everyone agree? Okay.
Excuse me, Sam, do you have any knowledge or basically what the committee that met last week, what they may recommend?
A little bit. I would hesitate to speak for them, but basically my understanding is that the conversation was about how you can actually make sure that the Ag Commission has some real influence and isn't just another advisory body that doesn't really get to weigh in when the decisions are difficult and contentious. So a couple of points on that I think included representation, how they weigh in specifically, but again I don't have the details in front of me.
If the Ag Commission was structured similar to what was recommended in the original ad hoc committee's recommendations, then it would be structured and have authority similar to the Zoning Board of Appeals, which would make sense to me. So they actually have authority to make decisions that are binding. And that, to me, is exactly what's needed here. We all know that reasonable exceptions will need to be made to the zoning, and that's fine if it's done in a thoughtful and an organized kind of way.
Kind of on a case-by-case basis.
Exactly. Because we know that there are people who live in the ag zone who are in a difficult situation, and that does need to be addressed, but it also can't be a free-for-all.
But then forming that board, they could either be almost like a subcommittee, us, or working with another board, and then, of course, planning board, ultimately, they have to work under. But they could look at maybe each lot, each business plan, each do really thoughtful, methodical look at each landowner to make those exceptions, that are just a free-for-all.
And
That's my hope, anyway.
yeah. Just I'm looking through my notes, and the person who was part of that process, who I spoke to, mentioned one of the other things that they were aiming for is to really have a vision for what agriculture and what the ag zone is for, and to really try to align policy with that vision. And I think that's that would only be beneficial. That to me seems like a really smart way to go about it, is to make sure that it's integrated with a strategic plan, that it's integrated with a comprehensive plan, and to have a group that really focuses in on that and can do all of that background research.
Yeah, because looking at this proposed ordinance it's conflicting to our current plan, and it's definitely conflicting to our role as commission.
I agree with the need for an agricultural commission, but I do just want to make sure that natural resources are being considered with equal importance. So I know it's not our job in this regard to create the outline for an agricultural commission, but I would highly recommend that whatever agricultural commission is established, they communicate directly with the Conservation Commission, because I assume we would be the other half of that equation. So I just want to make sure again that natural resources are being considered, not just ag. It's not just the ag zone. It's the Agriculture and Resource Protection Zone. While it's called the ag zone for convenience of shortening the name, doing so has really dropped natural resources out of the discussion.
Really good point.
So I think we've done a good job covering how we're going to move forward, presenting our feedback in regards to it's going to be in a caveat to having an ag commission, and here's some specifics that led us to that. So if everyone's comfortable moving forward with the specifics, I'll open up the floor to the use regulations section if we want to move forward with that.
Well, I have concerns about dividing the land, so just dividing the land anyway, but I have a lot of grave concerns about that, as you know. Even if it's a 5-10 year, I think that's very irrelevant. It's about being able to divide the land and how they're going to go about it. And if you specifically write that you can do it every 5 years or every 10 years, then that just kind of throws that out to put that in people's brain that divide their land up. I'm also concerned because if we continue to divide the land up, we're missing the original, I guess, purpose of why they were doing this proposed ordinance, which was to help residential and farming. And now it's starting to look like a developmental push, and I don't really like that at all. When we start dividing up these large plots, there's no going back. That's it. And a lot of the research that we're getting, the feedback that we're getting is, yeah, there's opportunity for small farm, but there's still a large need for large farms, and we don't have too many lots in Auburn that have these large farms. Part of Stephanie Gilbert's report back on planning board is that there's a significant amount, most of them are 200, 250 acre farms. Some of that has to do with the types of crops that they grow. And for example, with potatoes, I know we've brought this up, at least I did. I think it's Lay's or Frito-Lay, that they need to have at least 100 acres of continuous potatoes in order to get their bid for that. And if we keep breaking up things in Auburn, we won't have any of these large acre farms. So I'm afraid that we are, favoring one type of farming over another by breaking these lots up. And I think we need to preserve the large farms and the large lots as well as supporting the small ones. So part of my feedback.
Okay, so that would be under that first permitted use, if you will, that goes into detail about the division of the parcels.
Yeah,
Okay.
and when and how and all of that. I don't want to get caught up in all that details because we could run our heads for probably an hour.
Exactly.
But the gist of it is just the breaking up and how it's,
Being
how
able
the
to,
verbiage and how it's being addressed in that. I don't.
that it's not necessarily focusing on those existing non-conforming lots, that it's
Correct.
instead encouraging or
Correct.
permitting the division of bigger lots. And we also need to focus on the preservation of big lots for big farms for certain commercial
Yeah.
uses.
And it seems to be favoring one type of farming over another.
Thank you.
Speaking to your point of view, basically the mayor's ad hoc committee essentially ended up with a divided 4-4 vote based on a number of issues. In presenting the input I gathered from discussion within our committee, and that's something on prior. Essentially, they've made a recommendation on the agricultural resource establishing agricultural resource protection commission, and essentially under purpose. The purpose of the Agricultural Resource Protection Commission shall be to adjudicate special exceptions to land use regulations in the Agriculture and Resource Protection District, and to develop policies, uses, programs that promote agriculture, forestry, wildlife habitat, and in the conservation of land and natural resources consistent with the comprehensive plan.
That's more inclusive.
That basically is what you're saying.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
And any one of the other 4 members is here in the audience, and basically he can add or confirm as he wants to, but basically the majority feeling of that particular group was that essentially we are one, and it's unfortunate that there seems to be a splinter emphasis, and that really the wildlife, forestry, natural resource protection, agriculture, they're all one and the same, because basically the common thread is photosynthesis. And that essentially is environmentally important because it cleans our air, it cleans our water. Best management practices in each of those particular areas that I mentioned essentially are fully intersupportive of each other. Now, I'm not saying that's perfect, but if we're we're speaking of the establishment of an Ag and Resource Protection Commission, if we want to support the establishment of that, at some point, let's have a discussion of exactly how you'd like to have that structure. And I can share with you what they were suggesting, what those four members were suggesting, and you discuss and change, go from there anywhere as you like. But I'm not trying to veer away from this,
Right.
But I think we need to consider them concurrently because they are interrelated in how we might fit and how we might approach it.
Exactly. I would agree that it should be, one commission, not like an ag commission that would consult with us. I would agree that it should be all under one group. And I would like to, after this, if, either tonight or in probably a future meeting, discuss what that commission might look like and give a recommendation on that. I agree that, it wouldn't make sense to just say, yeah, create a Agriculture and Resource Protection Commission. Good luck. I think we would need to follow up. So I think we should definitely include the establishment of one commission in our feedback, and then in future meetings, discuss what that might look like. Any other thoughts on that? Or do we want to continue?
I would continue, and I concur, because we could spend a lot of time just trying to
Exactly.
do that right now, so we should probably have a meeting just for that.
Right. So,
We're still on permitted uses and
yes.
regulations.
So 1F says siting of residential structures shall avoid prime farmland soils and soils of statewide significance when alternatives exist on the parcel. Again, it's just extremely focused on strictly agricultural resources. If there's, a wetland or a vernal pool or significant, state significant wildlife habitat, I just think I understand, the specifics of the prime farmland soils and statewide soils. And I don't necessarily think we should exclude that, but maybe include and other natural resources when possible. I don't know how to exactly word it, but
This is one of the passages that gives me the greatest concern about this entire proposal, and really drove me to think we need to have an ag commission in place to review this before we do any of these more specific changes. Because I think you could drive a truck through this, frankly. I mean, if you have a 3-acre parcel and 2.5 acres of it is wooded, and you have great soil on that half acre that's already cleared, that's the most convenient to build on.
Right.
So that takes that land out of agriculture for a while. I mean, and I think, they're
Forever.
just forever. Arguably, I mean, you can clear it, you can amend the soil.
But once you put a house on there,
Once you put a soil, yeah, and once you put a house on the best soil on the land, then yeah. So that one gave me specific concern, and I think, Jordan, your point is very well taken too, that it gives no regard for wetlands, for any of the other important habitats that might be on a parcel like this. So I think
which is
that's
why I
a
was
very,
asking for the floodplains.
mm-hmm.
Because just like you were saying, when we got some of the maps, we definitely have the watersheds on there, Taylor Brook and Lake Auburn, and we did go over a little bit of that. We don't have specifically wetland map. And as we know, there's wetlands and there's vernal pools all over. And like to what Sam's saying is that's not inclusive.
Exactly. And it also begs the question too, if that area is already cleared and it's, half an acre, but that's the best spot for a house, and then you have to go and you have to bring in heavy machinery and grading equipment and clear these trees and, clear something that wasn't already cleared before. Is that necessarily best? And is it, fair exactly to the resident looking to build a home, if that's the whole idea, is to make it available for them? So I agree that it's specific and limiting at the same time. So that, I would recommend that includes natural resources, but also that would be something where I would say should be reviewed. The location would be reviewed by whatever Agriculture and Resource Protection Commission be established. I think the site of a proposed building or whatever structure be reviewed by that commission.
Sam's point on soils is very well taken, because essentially, as I recall from information that was provided to Mayor's group, basically there was slightly over 4,000 acres of prime soil originally in Auburn. 3/4 of that has already been
Developed.
and so basically there's only a little more than 1,000 left.
Yeah.
And in many instances, if you take the approach of looking at soil quality or soil type, essentially the wetlands will automatically be saved, because basically then the wetlands that don't normally exist in a high quality soil. And so you have primarily you would have Buxton or something like that in your wetland areas, and so that if you take that approach that he's suggesting, and then look at it, you can guide an awful lot of what those that want to build houses everywhere, basically you guide that into a more constructive role.
So I think the general feedback would be it needs to be more inclusive, and that it would also be, contingent upon some kind of more formal review by a commission to make sure that you're resulting in the least amount of impacts to resources as possible. Would that be a fair, summation of that point?
And as far as natural resources are concerned, basically I think the Conservation Commission has already established what we feel, basically, really, that we've identified 4 natural resources with basically water, air, sunshine, and land. And so that if we're going to talk natural resources at some point, I think to clarify that in people's minds so they know what we're talking about, what natural resources really are.
Exactly, and that's why I want to add natural resources into the definitions page. And I mean, presumably, if you're building a house, you're going to have to apply for a Maine State Natural Resource Protection Act permit anyway, which would, they would also give further guidance. But I think, like you're saying, how if you're just going to apply for a building permit, you might not know the extent of all the natural resources. So I think having that commission in place to help you site your house would be beneficial to both parties. Okay.
Well, in regard to that too, in part of the regulations, you have to go through a lot of federal stuff. You can't be building that close to water, for example. So when you're decreasing these lots to 3 acres, you might not even have a space to put a home if you are too close to the water. A lot of regulations are between 100 feet, 500 feet, depends on what the business is doing, what is considered the farming on that unit. Tiz's feedback to the two of us, she brought up a good point, was the truck garden.
Mm-hmm.
They've taken rifle ranges out, but they left truck gardens in there. And if you've got a 3-acre lot that's in a watershed, how can you have a truck garden? And what does that entail, and how close do you put that?
Yeah, did they define truck garden in the definition page? Because that was
They
one
did
I had
not,
highlighted.
and that's my concern, because I've seen regulations where you're not supposed to even have that within 500 feet, depending. Are they drained of oil? Are they just, are they total garden trucks, or are they like auto parts? I mean, we're already having issues in Auburn right now with some of these junkyards. On the watershed, we're having tires that are falling into the Little Androscoggin. There's been buses that have half fallen into the Little Androscoggin. So there's huge concern about allowing a truck garden to be that close to, again, a water source or even a natural resource. And then boundaries between a lot owner here and a lot owner there. I mean, I probably don't want my neighbor on a 3-acre lot having a truck garden right up against the border of my lot. I don't want to look at that. I don't want to smell oil. I don't want oil leaching into my soil, damaging my well if I have a drilled well out there. There's a
Mhm.
lot of stuff that's going on. So I don't like the truck garden thing. I don't know why they threw out the rifle thing. Again, I don't want to rewrite this
Well,
ordinance for
where's
them.
it throughout the rifle thing? Because on
But-
the next page, under this special exemption, it has rifle, pistol, skeet, or trap shooting ranges, public or private. So I think they actually kept both of them in.
No, which one are you looking at? They've struck that out.
I have it struck out
Yeah,
from
me
the
too. Oh, okay.
2019 version.
On the,
Yeah,
on which one?
the 211 and the
211-19?
219.
Oh, okay. I don't have it as struck out on mine for some reason. I'm not sure why, but
Okay.
I will
Well, that was
take note
struck
of that.
out, so I guess my question is, why could you allow truck gardens, and that's not
I would
defined.
agree. That doesn't seem very congruent. So I will take note of that. And at least add in a definition of a truck garden, but that we would prefer that to not be included in
And
the zone.
something that says must meet federal and local, you know.
Right.
As a point of reference, standpoint of lots, the information provided is they basically, according to the tax assessor, there are 107 parcels in the ag zone, 10 acres or less. And there are, I did a rough count of, so there are basically 24 of those are less than an acre. Another 36 are between 1 acre and 3 acres. So that leaves approximately 47 in the 3 to 10 category currently existing in the ag zone.
And so, looking at some of those lots, I know that we briefly, a few of us spent some time on the maps, and it looks like some people have had a large lot, and what they've done is they've taken, let's say they have a 20-acre lot, they broke it up, they put their house on a small piece, and they put the rest in an easement, either for conservation easement or recreation easement or whatever. That's to lower their property tax base. We see the most of those usually around like Taylor Pond, Lake Auburn, where the taxes are a little higher, so people are trying to work that. It's not really taken that much advantage of. I mean, you look throughout those lots, a lot of people could be breaking up their property and doing that. So I think those little tiny ones you're looking at is what they've done.
But actually, most of, a lot of those are not in the ag zone,
Okay.
but they'd be in some other zone.
But again, is this proposed ordinance going to encourage breaking up of lots? You know? And are they trying to, you know, decrease their residential property taxes? And if we increase the breaking up of lots out in the agricultural, then we're dealing with all of that. So tax base could be a whole nother 3-hour meeting. which we know.
According to the planning board meeting minutes, the draft version from May 14th, Eric had replied that there are approximately 87 lots between 3 and 10 acre parcels that currently exist in the ag zone, but not all of them meet the road frontage requirement. Some are cemeteries and utility owned lots. So 87 is the number, but not all of them would meet the requirement.
Well, that would.
Some are landlocked. Yeah.
That's different than the information that was provided to the mayor's group.
Well, again, maybe that one's considering ones that would also meet road frontage, because the 87, they don't all meet. So I don't know what the number of lots existing between 3 and 10. Off the top of my head, I don't know the number that do meet that. So maybe that's what the discrepancy is. But we also had talked about.
And excuse me, the other interesting possible statistic basically was, and this is just background, I'm not,
Sure.
Those that were listed in the group provided, the information provided to the mayor's, essentially in that 3 to 10 group, there was all except that there was one lot, the so-called a legacy lot, which basically existed prior to the beginning of the current zoning on. All of the others, ownership basically was either acquired, now whether the purchase or transferred, and I'm not, but all of those were acquired by the current ownership since the beginning of the zoning ordinance. So actually, at the point the current owner acquired it, basically they knew they weren't allowed to build under that.
Right.
So that's not a big issue, but some people raise that question, and so anyway, that's just more background information.
Well, I like your point there because I think it echoes the question we've been asking is how many people are really in need of this change? How many people have come forth and said, well, I'm in a non-conforming lot that I want to build on? And what we've been told is that that information is not readily available and would be very hard to collect. And in the email that I had sent with the agenda items, there was an email from Francis from Bates, and I had told him that that's something he offered to do some more research with his students. He had funding and students lined up and asked our opinions. And I said, that's something that we've been asking is how many people need this? Is there a way that you could determine that based on surveying or questionnaires? And that's something that he did say that they would be capable of doing. So I think determining exactly how many people with those existing non-conforming lots they knew they couldn't build on are now wanting to build on them. That's not known, and I think it's important to know before changing an ordinance.
And are they wanting to build because they're trying to support agriculture and their farmers want to live on their land, which is what we keep being told, or is it because they simply want to build a home? We've had a couple of meetings here where we've had a few people pretty verbally say that they live on a 3-acre lot, they just want a retirement home, and they have no urge to even farm it or do anything with it. And they're hoping that this ordinance will pass so they can put their retirement home on there.
I think they're at
That is exactly what we're trying to prevent.
at the various groups that have met, whether it be the mayor's group or the crossroads study or planning board hearings, that sort of thing. It's been generally between 3 and 5 people that I've heard actually basically convey a specific desire to build for what may have been a valid reason. There are others which fall in the more speculatory category that probably beyond. But actually, the 3 to 5, basically, which have actually conveyed a specific interest and have a definite proposal or a issue that needs to be adjudicated.
And I believe that there was the letter mailed to all of the residents of the AGRP zone about the public hearing, one of the first public hearings from planning boards. So anyone who owns land in that zone would have gotten a notification. So if they had an issue and wanted to bring it forward, they would have come forward most likely. If they wanted to build on a non-conforming lot. Can't say with certainty, but you would think that they would show up.
I would add, I do think it's really important to get that information, and if we have an opportunity to get it, and I know Francis is eager and has students who are eager to help with that, I just don't see the need to rush changing our zoning in a pretty drastic way to 40% of the city's landmass for the needs of 3 to 5 landowners. I mean,
Yeah.
I think it comes down to that pretty simply.
And again, that's not protecting natural resources or
Right,
supporting
right.
farming or agriculture or any of that.
Which is, and we have to keep coming back to the purpose. I mean,
Exactly.
I think that we really have to keep that in mind.
I would agree. Moving on for specific feedback, we were on the truck gardens is where we left off. I had under the special exception uses, section B, 1A, where it says sawmill and accessory activities shall not be detrimental to the neighborhood of the city by reason of special danger of fire or explosion, pollution of rivers or perennial streams, or accumulation of refuse. Perennial streams is a legally defined term. So I was just thinking that should be added to the definitions page as it wasn't in there, and maybe just referred to where that term is defined legally. But a perennial stream is, different from an intermittent or ephemeral. So I think defining perennial stream would be important in the definitions page for this ordinance.
I agree, and to add to that, the wood processing operations and whatnot, there's some federal verbiage in there, and it looks like the city's going to try to propose going against that, so I don't know if they've done research on that. Stephanie Gilbert from Federal Ag is looking into that, and we're waiting for some final feedback, but I go back to this truck garden as well as now the wood processing, and they did write, you've got 75 feet from any river, perennial stream, like say 250. Tiz's proposal was 150 and 500, and I think that's more likely where it's going to end up standing for
Okay.
federal purposes. Again, now you've got a 3-acre lot, and you got to be proposed according to that. We'll say 500 feet from any zoning boundary, and then 150 feet from any river or lake. So, do you have enough room to put your house now?
Okay.
If
So
you're having a wood processing at the same time.
it
on
sounds
3
like
acres.
that's being reviewed, like you said, legally by Auburn's lawyers and also by the state. So anywhere where we think, or we can just add it as like a disclosure at the beginning that everything also needs to comply with state and federal standards,
yeah.
just to generally blanket the entire ordinance instead of going through maybe line by line. But I would agree that that should be in there.
Well, a 3-acre lot and a wood processing operation, to me, you know, I don't know how you could do that on 3 acres, I guess is my question too. If that was even in there.
I don't know
But it's a
either.
special exception, and so, again, we go back to special exceptions. So we're making a special exception that you
Right.
can have a wood processing operation possibly on 3 acres as long as it falls under all of this verbiage that they've put in there. So I know some of it was in the original ordinance too, they just didn't touch it, but again, special exceptions. That's
Right.
quite a special.
Yeah, I would agree.
And having been at the last meeting of the Conservation Commission, one of the things that stuck out to me was how many loopholes have been exploited over the years, and even just not loopholes, but a lack of enforcement. So, thinking about even the structure of the planning board, if they're giving the sign off on this, how do we make sure that it's not just whoever happens to be on the planning board at that time can give the go ahead for
Right.
something that aligns with their personal interests or those of their friends? I mean, I think we have to be thinking about that too.
Wasn't that one of the concerns about one of the gentlemen that spoke so much at so many of these meetings, that he has 2 homes basically going? He's gotten the okay apparently from the planning board in the past. Somebody gave him permission to build his log cabin on his land, and now he's told that he cannot finish it. And he's been waiting for several years, and wants this ordinance changed so that he can finish his log cabin. So I think you're right. The planning board at the time gives special permission, then you're going to get with these hung-ups. And
Well, and I would also add to that is that was discussed in the draft minutes or in the planning board meeting, and in the draft minutes it kind of touches on that, and I won't read it verbatim, but basically it was saying, we can, if we see that something's happening that's not in line with the ordinance, we can stop it. But the better thing to be would avoid an impact,
right.
and also, especially if it's a commercial operation and they're doing things that aren't, conducive to the ordinance, what do you do? Just hit them with a fine and, then they can just continue on. It's not the best approach to allow it and then say, oh, okay, well, we'll stop it or, give them a consequence. It's best to prevent impacts from happening in the first place. So I would, encourage that perspective, not like, yeah, we'll just stop it if something bad happens.
Right, it's very reactive.
Because you're already, like you said, building on that. Once you build on it, I mean, what are you going to tell them to
You've
tear
already
their house
destroyed
down?
the soil, now you got to take your home down and...
Well, and like you said, this
A big hole in the land.
Yeah.
special
Soil's gone
exemption was
forever.
granted, and the most they did was say, no, stop, you can't continue building, but what's there is already there, and the likelihood of you saying, yeah, okay, now you have to go disassemble it and return it back to existing conditions is very unlikely. So again, I think we all kind of agree that we would prefer to avoid the impact first instead of trying to mitigate it afterwards.
Mhm.
I think Sam made a good point, but the thing I think that it's interesting, the difference between, essentially the original, I think you've all seen these maps, and essentially the 1973 map reflects really the condition that existed from 1960 to roughly the mid 1980s. And essentially, this is what occurred after mid-80s with exactly the same ordinance and with just a few tweaks that was approved by the planning board and the council But essentially the planning board and the council, none of them had really any background in that, most of them in natural resources or agriculture or forest. So that here is where we get back again to the importance of the Ag Resource Sector Commission, Advisory Commission, which essentially, if you structure it right, would have the experience, which basically a knowledge, which would have concept and understanding of the unintended consequences of a lot of well-meaning decisions. And I suspect that a lot of the current decisions that essentially we might criticize right now probably would never have occurred if they had been made by people with some background knowledge of the actual conditions and the unintended consequences that can occur. So there again, we come back to the makeup structure of the Resource Commission, and essentially, I personally feel that, they should have some authority, such as Sam suggested, as far as Fields Board or whatever. But in most cases, I think it would be sounder decision making them to recommend and to the planning board, and then the planning board to the council, because basically the decisions need to be coordinated, and we really don't need to have a 3-4-headed monster out here make decisions.
And the maps you're looking at too, and the feedback we've gotten, just to reiterate, is that we looked at how much development has happened since the 60s, and we looked at both the agricultural zone and then all other land zones, all residential. 50% of the new development since the 60s has happened in the ag zone, 50% has happened in the residential. And so there's still just as much development of the ag zone as the ordinance is written. Is that,
So,
to me,
but the difference essentially is implementation.
I think it does echo back to this idea of enforceability that we've really touched upon in the last couple of meetings, with the current ordinance already having some areas where members of the public have addressed us that they feel it's not being enforced, and how would it be enforced with a more lax ordinance. And I would agree that, especially when it comes to a special exception use, with some of these more industrialized operations, that an Agriculture and Resource Protection Commission would have the, first and foremost recommendation that it go to them, because they would specialize in this. And then they can move up the chain from there. So I would agree with that recommendation for the special exception uses, at least, if not all of it, but having that newly formed AGRP commission be the first one to take a look at it and provide their recommendation.
I wonder too, I mean, to your point, Jordan, because there has been so much conversation about enforcement, I wonder if within the planning for the Ag and Resource Protection Commission, there could be something about, the responsibilities of this commission include maintaining an inventory or information on the current status of this land and what's happening with it, and also figuring out an enforcement structure of some kind. I'm not sure what that looks like. I don't expect them to be doing the enforcing, but it would be interesting to give them that initiative, to give them that that task as part of what they need to consider. Usually it's just a more recommendation, advisory kind of thing. We're hoping for something with teeth, but we also see the need for enforcement. I mean, I think that's really been a clear theme running through all of this, and the data that Rihanna just shared, 50.
I would definitely agree that when, in future meetings, we're discussing what an Agriculture and Resource Protection Commission would look like, that be written into that, in our recommendation at least, that we keep an inventory of these natural resources, which, the GIS department and Eric Cousins have worked really hard to develop, and hopefully then would be easier to maintain moving forward, just updating the files. But I think that's definitely something to keep track of for future meetings when we really figure out what that commission would look like.
As far as enforcement is concerned, here again, going back to preference, one key difference between what existed, what created those two maps, was basically for that first 25 years, the reason they expanded the zoning in the first place was basically to prevent urban sprawl. And was a consistent directive the council, the planning board, or whatever, throughout that mid 50s up to the mid 80s, prevent urban sprawl. It started weakening. That council directive started weakening as you moved through the late 70s into the early 80s. But then, since the mid 80s, there hasn't been that clear directive in any direction. Because public opinion has shifted and the council has shifted with it. And basically, Eric or others that have been tasked with the code enforcement or whatever, essentially haven't always had the support that they need to implement. And so I'm not being critical of any group, but basically we've got to be honest with ourselves that the reason there was no change in that first 25 years, you had that same consistent council commitment to oppose urban sprawl. And that was because of this costs and essentially, which actually the Crossroads study surfaced that essentially it's a red ink. Residential housing, particularly in rural areas, is a red ink situation as far as the cities.
It's right in our comp plan, like, right in our current comprehensive plan. I know that we're still working on the next one, but in our current comprehensive plan, it does specifically say to protect that zone, work from development in the core to the outside because of those factors that you just said. Because of the municipality cost, the emergency services, that they wanted to keep most of the population cored. And what I'm saying is we've developed 50% outside the core as well as inside the core.
But you haven't had the political support to make that happen.
Yeah, but that's under the current ordinance. So now we're going to have a more laxed ordinance. What's going to happen in the agricultural zone then? If already 50% of that is being developed, which is just as much in your residential and urban areas, that's not supporting the comp plan either. That's not supporting development in the core and then working out. We have sprawl.
I think that's definitely important to note. And in the planning board minutes, I had noticed there was some discussion on what negative development really was, and I don't think that's for us to decide what is negative. Development is development. If there was nothing there and you put up a farm field, that's development. If you put in a paved driveway, that's development. A fence, it's development. Shed, house, whatever. So I think I don't want to get bogged down too much. Not that anyone here is, but development's development. And I just think, like you said, no matter what kind it is, if it's a restaurant or a house, it's going to be development. So, subdividing these lots into buildable lots has the potential to increase development and therefore urban sprawl. So that's really what we want to avoid doing. And I think the commission, our Conservation Commission has done a great job keeping that in mind and really forecasting out in the future of what consequences this will have. And I think that's another thing that we should echo is, yes, these subdivided lots will have the potential to increase development and therefore urban sprawl.
And I think, some of the hope with these, the stated goals are that, you'd get 20 to 30 new small farms and, have this thriving local diversified farm scene. I mean, the hope is one thing, but then, it's also our job to think about how is this going to be abused? How can we prevent the worst case scenarios of, people using this to ends that we don't envision, that we don't just hope for, and I think, we really need to be very careful with that.
And I'm with you. You know that I support the Good Local Food Council, and I'm very involved in that. But again, you can have a small farm or Harvey farm anywhere in Auburn. It doesn't have to be in the agricultural zone. And we don't want to favor small farms or large farms. We're trying to be neutral. And, I know Michelle's out in the audience has said this before. There's a very big difference between agriculture and being a garden. So when we start breaking up lots into 3 acres, that's where you're kind of losing agriculture. I see that more as, I have a small garden on my lot, I'm going to support my family type of thing. Mind you that once you have 3 acres, you've got to have your borders, protect your soils, build your house, probably a garage. If you're truly doing some kind of agricultural farming, you're going to have a barn, I'm sure, greenhouse, whatever. How much of that space is actually going to be left anyway? And is 3 acres even enough to accommodate all of that?
And,
And we have lots of small farms that are going up in the rural residential area, or, the low, even in the urban areas, we have people that have very large, half to a quarter acre farms, right, in these high density zones. Anyway, I'm getting off topic, but I guess we're all kind of in that support.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, and I think it's just important to keep reiterating, you can go one way. You can have a small intensive gardening farming operation on a 10-acre lot, but if you've broken a 10-acre lot up into 3 parcels, you can't go back to a larger farm.
Exactly.
So I just wanted to make one more point to what Morris was saying, because I thought that was very helpful historical context, that part of why the zone was successful at first was because of the support from the city council. And one thing that I think maybe we could do as a commission is really restate, and very strongly, the need to be committed to that vision. And, as I understand it, the comprehensive plan should be a binding document, that guides city policy. So if there's deviation from that, then they need to be reminded of that. And I think that's something we can do as an advisory board.
I would agree that consensus and having strong support, not just from city council, but from all the groups that have been asked to weigh in on this, is going to be important. Like you said, we have, 4 different groups contributing opinions, and we all just give our opinion, and none of them are really taken into consideration. Then that it's not going to have that support that it needs to really be successful. I would agree.
And Maurice's history is very, very important, because understanding where we were, how we got there, and where we're going.
Yep. I think it's very important. Shows us where we've been, and history repeats. Can be successful again. So moving forward in the specific feedback, right down from the line on B1C, when natural vegetation is removed, it shall be replaced within 6 months with other vegetation which will be equally effective in retaining erosion or retarding erosion and will preserve natural beauty. I just wanted to specify that known invasives should be avoided. Things like Phragmites, Merle's honeysuckle, multiflora rose, all those nasty plants. Just making sure that we select native or naturalized species and avoid knowingly planting invasives, because that wasn't stated in there.
And again, going back to the 6 months, where did that come from, and how do you do that in 6 months? So if you're replacing grass, you could easily grow grass in 6 months. If you're replacing trees, that could take longer than 6 months. So I guess that's my question.
And I just asked,
is that all inclusive, or is that making it?
I think both of those are excellent points. I'm just curious, is the language we're reviewing now, what version of this ordinance proposal does that come from? Because I'm looking at, some of the new language is in bolded, underlined text, and I think some of the old language is not, and I just am trying to figure out what's new and what's not. Which version is that from?
I'm looking at the 2/11/19 version of this ordinance. I will say, when I printed this, it looks like the track changes didn't necessarily translate all that great. So I'm not sure if what I'm looking at was like bolded or something, but I am looking at the February 11th, 19 version.
I just wasn't sure if that specific point is among the proposed changes, or if that's part of the older ordinance that's being amended.
I think it might be part of the older ordinance, but I was just kind of going through this, judging it all equally.
I think
maybe that's not the right thing to be doing. I can totally take that into account, but it just caught my eye. I was like, I don't want people out here planting invasive.
I totally agree with you. I just wanted to clarify, because I wasn't sure, because I didn't go through some of those older provisions as closely.
No, thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate that. Does anyone else have other specific recommendations for any of the special exception uses in section B?
On section B4, this gets to the conversation we were just having. Any residence constructed for farm labor shall not be converted to non-farm residential use except by permission of the planning board following a recommendation by the agricultural advisory board. Again, I thought that was something that left a lot of room for exceptions that could be risky to the integrity of the ag zone. And I thought it would be useful to really emphasize that, if the agricultural advisory board is being asked to make a recommendation on that, does it have any clout, or is it something that could just be disregarded as an advisory comment on this? Because, I think that's ripe for abuse.
And it
So-
does look like the intent is to give them some authority. And yet,
Yeah.
the conversation is, do we give, and what
Right.
if,
Yeah. Well, and
Um,
it's, the way it's written is it's just a recommendation. It's not a binding recommendation. So, I'm not, I was just thinking worst
for
case
the
scenario
special
here.
exceptions, right? In other
Yeah.
words, I think the intent is everything that falls outside of this ordinance, if there's a special exception, it needs to go in front of that board.
Yeah.
Planning board. But again, we don't have that.
I think that
Created.
I think the section right now, the original section, way back to the original, basically we could build farm labor housing, but then later, basically, the planning board changed that so that you could build farm labor housing, but it had to be removed within 6 months following the the lack of use or whatever. And there's a problem both ways there, but way it is right now, that basically it has to be removed within 6 months. Essentially, it makes it impossible to invest in quality housing for a capable employee. So that raises that particular question, and I think a recommendation. I really think the authority should continue to stay with the planning board and the council, because we just don't want too many decision making. But if there's a recommendation from the Ag Advisory Board and it's disregarded, then essentially that raises that to public scrutiny because it's public action.
Would it be, I understand what you're saying, you have too many people chiming in and giving binding recommendations. If they do decide not to take the recommendation of the newly established commission, would it be fair to require some kind of formal documentation on why, almost like a dissenting opinion or something, like why we chose not to go with this recommendation, and then that can be logged and put into some kind of formal record keeping? So that we can look back and say, okay, this is why, not just like 30 years from now, oh, well, like, I guess they just liked me, We have a documented reason why that recommendation wasn't followed. I think that would be a good thing to have if we're not looking at giving the newly established commission the authority to override, if you will.
In private discussions, basically, I became aware of a situation that I had been aware of before, where essentially a couple brothers basically were all in gung-ho, enthused, I'm going farming, and each build a house. And then basically, after a couple of years of hard work, they decided they didn't want to farm anymore, so they just walked away. Now, should those houses be torn down, or should they be reused? Should they be reused for anything? Should it just be reused for agricultural use? There was no answer.
Yeah.
But it's a situation like that I think an Ag Advisory Commission could basically maybe advise in a reasonably wise manner, consistent with the ordinance or whatever, and basically could establish something with that might fit that particular case, but basically would there again would be another good example of unintended circumstances, which basically surfaces in every single discussion, whether it's a planning board discussion. That's all. The reason the planning board discussion was as long as complicated as it was the other night was the unintended consequence.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's why I raised the question about this. Is I totally get what you're saying, Morris, and I mean I see the need to be able to put up good housing for farm workers. I think that's a definite benefit. I just worry that someone could use that to put up an apartment building on their
Yeah.
lot and say, oh, I had a farm worker. He was working on my farm for the last 3 months, and now he's just living here. And I'm taking rent. And this is
Well,
great.
you have a situation like that, very similar, that basically Whiting Farm, basically, they had some interest in basically building some houses for Somalis, whatever, just to get them started and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And there again, it's another example of what you're talking about.
And I think that kind of plays into the standards that we're requiring for what this definition of a farm is, and our concern with a $1,000 investment being too low as a standard. In addition, with the reduced lot size, it's going from one extreme to the other. So, when they could have benefited by providing housing for farmhands and it was too hard to build, well, now maybe it's going to be too easy for people who, like you said, don't really follow through with it. And now we have this building that, well, it would be a waste to tear it down, but what do we do with it? So I kind of think it echoes back to having higher standards for, not a 50% income rule, but also not a $1,000 investment, having a reasonable middle and a reasonable expectation for this definition of what, the financial commitment will be.
All right, that's a good example of one approach type thing. Another suggestion that's been tossed around in private conversation was that basically anyone who builds a house or has a request authority to build a house in the ag zone, whatever, basically, particularly with farm labor housing, basically provide a bond or some other financial security to just ensure performance at
Follow through.
follow through. And if they didn't follow through, essentially the city's financial cost of moving a trailer or something like that would be covered by the initial financial security.
I'd like to see, obviously I'm in agreement. The $1,000 is very, very laxed.
But there again, we're drifting off into the unintended consequences thing, which basically everything pretty much moves to. So that's where I've explored a lot of options, but basically I keep coming back to take the original one and then approach it one topic at a time. So basically that you reduce the possibility of unintended consequences because everybody's attention is focused on a single issue.
That's also where the the new agriculture advisory board, or whatever it's going to be called, will be so important. No matter how carefully crafted the language is, or people will find a way around it. There's always a loophole.
Mm-hmm.
This particular ordinance has gigantic loopholes, but even if it was much tighter, the current ordinance as it exists now, as discussed, loopholes big enough to support 50% of the development of the city for the last few decades. So there has to be some kind of enforcement. A body that's able to interpret the ordinance according to its purpose and make decisions.
And maybe keep an eye on those lots. Going back to the income thing, what if instead of income tied, period, that they just change it to you have to submit a comprehensive business plan, you have to explain why you want to build your residence on your lot, and then again, the ag advisory board or planning board for that matter can look at that and say, okay, We have a justified comprehensive business plan here, like you do for any business. And this is the particular agriculture that they're going to do. Are they dairy farmers? Are they going to be doing hydroponics or something smaller? And then maybe that works on a 3-acre lot and they say, okay, maybe it's something like dairy farming, and no, you can't do dairy farming on a 3-acre lot. How many cows are you going to have? 2? So, or how many chickens you're going to have? That's where they could look at that comprehensive plan and make that one exception on a case-by-case basis.
But you've also
Looking
got
at
another
all of
thing,
that.
which, basically, technology is changing everything in all our lives, and change is constant. And so basically, you can't really update an ordinance every year like that. And so basically, having a specialized group which can recommend, builds a framework which basically can build in an opportunity to update, go along. Because who knows, for basically in 5 years, we may need to have a special garage for our robot.
I agree that, we see how hard it is to change an ordinance, and making sure that it's something that is flexible enough to account for, not just 5 years, but, 30, 50 years in the future. There was some discussion about, oh, well, if we see a trend of abuse, then we could just change the ordinance. But I think that's just tossing the problem in the next generation's hand, or the next cycle of government's hands, and that's not fair to anyone, really, because this zone does influence us all. It is a resource protection zone in addition to agriculture, so handling it properly now is going to benefit us in the long run, as opposed to just saying, yeah, we'll just change the ordinance if it gets messy, because we've seen how this process is. And
well, look at the
not
watershed. They say that we are as successful today at protecting the Lake Auburn watershed only because the agricultural zone has done that. And yeah, there are other factors that Auburn has been trying to buy up land and put it in conservation easements and all that, but that wouldn't have been so successful if a lot of that watershed was not in the agriculture. That has limited development in that area, and we're dealing with that issue now. And a lot of them have said, like Polly, this is decades long, so this is stuff that happened before the agricultural zone was really being enforced and protected. So only now are we going to feel the full effects before it peaks, and that's what we're dealing with. And if we develop more in watersheds, we're going to poison them more for decades down the road. Will we even know what the impact of that is? So again, why would you want to go backwards when we're trying to go forward?
Well, we're already having some impact from this as far as
The
runoff
sprawl.
is concerned. And so there's some areas I think we could tighten it, but we ought to learn from our mistakes. What I will do basically, a good example, and I don't mean to jump around, but I just use this as an example. 60-2 definition. Now there is 3 printed pages or 2 words defining a farm, defining a farmer.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, talk about bureaucracy. Basically, a single well-phrased sentence, each of those could do it.
Mm-hmm.
And in fairness to the average person who might be exploring this, we should be ashamed of ourselves to recommend something, 3 printed pages for 2 words.
Not to mention the words that I left out. How long would that be?
Excuse me for that, but that to me tops the cake.
Yeah, and the more inclusive they try to be, the more disclusive they are, because then they say, well, it's not there.
And I think I had included some definitions that weren't necessarily in the proposed changes, but like perennial stream is something I wanted to see defined. Natural resources that would be protected under the zone is something I wanted to see defined. Adaptive reuse is something I wanted to see defined. So there were a lot of things that, maybe weren't previously defined in the ordinance. So maybe that wouldn't be the appropriate context to discuss this, but if we
It's
did.
not including forests and trees too. So we talk about
Exactly.
forestry, even part of agriculture, and then part of the resource protection is including forestry, and yet in the definitions of farm and farmer, which make it so that you can build on your land at a 3-acre, we're discluding now all of a sudden forestry and trees.
Right.
So part of this ordinance is to protect that, and yet it's not a definition of a farmer because we've taken that out, and so therefore they are also excluded.
Mhm.
You can be a tree
Exactly.
farmer. So if you're a tree farmer, now you're excluded from being able to build.
And I'm
It's-
not exactly sure if it was covered in, reviewing the changes, but adding to the definitions, I think, is
Yeah,
something
where's
that it should be
Forestry
considered
should
for
be
sure.
in there. There should be a bunch in there about forestry.
I would
There's
agree.
many types of forestry. So I have concerns about that too while we're in the definition stuff. And the whole as adjusted by the IRS, well, Stephanie's already talked about that's being redone anyway. So even if they kept that 1,000 acres, $1,000 investment right now, it's 2,000 states, 1,000 federal. So you
Mhm.
already got to go to 2,000. That's already conflicting.
Right.
And Stephanie has said that USDA and all them are reevaluating right now because those are like 1970s dollars, and they're going to update them to $2017, I
Bring it
believe,
to 5.
which will bring it to somewhere between 5 and 8, depending if you're looking at federal or state.
Right.
So that's already conflicting too. There's so many conflicting things in here. It's not even like at least 2.5 acres need to be devoted to the production of crops, grazing livestock. Again, where's forestry? If I'm a
And-
tree farmer, I can't even.
Yeah. I was just going to add to the point that you were just making, Rihanna. The income has to be adjusted, and that has to be adjusted regularly. So if it's put in the ordinance, even if we update that figure now from 1,000 to 5,000 in 10 years,
Yeah.
it's going to be completely outdated. And
Then it still should say in 2017 dollars.
Yeah.
$5,000 investment, let's say, in 2017 dollars, and that should be updated frequently.
Hmm.
But they're going to keep getting in trouble with this.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you should put a dollar amount on there. I mean, going back to that 50%, the two problems I saw with that originally was, one, it's high. Most farmers cannot manage 50%, but it's also including the whole family instead of just the landowner. Maybe the easiest thing is, one, put it as a landowner and maybe decrease it to, I don't know, 35%, we'll say, and see what happens. So when we start tagging the $1,000 minimal investment or tagging it into this federal tax reserve, we're really gonna get in trouble with that.
I almost
That's
like
gonna be
Sorry, go ahead.
I almost like what you
evolving.
talked about in terms of, maybe there should be some kind of financial contribution, and I don't know exactly what that would look like. Is it money invested? Is it % of your income? But when you talk about what you would need to bring to the table, a business plan, I like those kind of requirements because they're not exclusive in the sense of, the financial restriction, but it's, are you committed to this?
Right.
What is your plan moving forward? Are we going to require like updates or something? So I think we should keep some kind of financial commitment, but I also like the more qualitative commitments of, coming in prepared and showing whatever commission and planning board and city council that you are prepared and committed to this idea. Not just like, yeah, okay, I'm going to invest $1,000 my first year, fill out a form, and keep going. So I liked what you said about the business plan aspect of it.
I agree with that. I think it's really important to have those qualitative measures, and there are some ways that you could verify that, and the Ag Commission, Resource Protection Commission can be part of that process. There are also state resources that could look into the viability of those plans. We have the cooperative extension that could be, we could solicit their input and make that part of the process. The one concern that I have with that is, it's one thing for a farmer now to say, I have a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, and even to carry through on that for 10 years. But when they hit 60 and they are worn out and want to retire from that initiative, then what happens to that land? And, I don't know that we can answer that question. I mean, I think the loss of farms and habitat is something that, we're struggling with across the country now. But I just want to in terms of thinking about this ordinance, how do we think not only about, the plans of the current farmers and would-be farmers, but also how do we protect that land for when they finish up or when they retire and move on? I don't have an answer to that,
Well,
but
even-
I think we need to think about it a bit.
Also on that, I'm not sure exactly how it's handled by the current ordinance, but if you're setting up an annual, like $1,000 investment, does it say annual or just one time?
No,
Investment of
it's
$1,000.
annual.
For someone who retires and maybe doesn't want to move off their land right away, how are you going to adjust that ordinance language for them? Like, well, they're not necessarily going to be having an annual contribution all the time when they're retired. So you're not going to kick them off their land. So that language needs to be there to protect people who are living there, but, and we're farming, but retired.
Well, there is some verbiage within the ordinance, the proposed ordinance, that says, without unforeseeable, the landowner, yada. And
Right,
that's
in the
supposed
case
to-
of a drought or
I
something
think
like
the
that.
idea is to be inclusive of that. Somebody has a medical event or happens that they can't farm anymore.
Right.
Unintended consequences type of thing.
I don't know if the Crossroads report addresses that question, but it would be interesting to look at what other municipalities have done to try to support the transfer of farms and agricultural property and maintain that, and
Keep it farmed.
and keep that in mind as we consider this ordinance.
I like that. How to facilitate. Okay. I want to try and, I don't want to rush anyone, obviously, but
know,
we do
'cause
have a
this-
couple members of the public, so I want to make sure that if they have anything to say, that they can come up and speak. So members of the public, if you wanted to,
Michelle's just-
I want to make sure that you have a chance to speak. So are we okay to put our discussion on hold
Sure.
and let them come speak?
Well,
Would that be okay?
basically, I will, a day or two, I will forward an email copy of a proposal that Ag had essentially for structuring of a ag and resource section.
Thank you.
And essentially, it may or may not agree with what the other group did, but I'd be interested in learning what they, hopefully they would share their suggestions or whatever with Jordan, and basically she could share it with our group, because I really think that, planning board, conservation commission, any group that the council names, such as that group, if kind of circulate our suggestions or questions, whatever, between ourselves, that basically we can come up with better answers than any one of us can individually.
I think that's a good idea. Like you said, reducing silos, breaking those barriers down is something that we've set out to do from the very beginning of this commission. So I think, especially with the amount of input being brought into this whole discussion, that would be important. So members of the public, would you like to speak, or you want to just keep listening? You can speak from your seats, or if you want it to be on record, you'll have to go to the mic. But if you want to do it informally, you don't have to go to the mic, but if you want it on record, you do.
Is one better than the other? That one works. Two quick things. I haven't received any meaningful information about this as of yet. I've inquired, but I can't seem to get a really good answer. If this were to go through, the property that I currently own, which is 60 acres on 2 different parcels in the ag zone, they abut each other. The possibility of my taxes changing significantly are pretty great. And I keep hearing the mayor saying this is partially about bringing in new small farmers. That's exactly what I am. I have a small agricultural operation, a composting operation, that's been in effect for about almost 7 years now. It does not fully support me. I am a small business owner, small ag business owner. Based on what I think I've found for information, my taxes would increase to a point where I would not be able to afford my property taxes. So the claim that this is to support small farmers, it doesn't fly for me. It's not adding up. It certainly does not support me as a small farmer who already lives here in Auburn. So why are we trying to bring in people who we think might buy property and have a small farm in Auburn when it's going to drive your existing small farmers out? I will have to sell my property, and I will lose my business based on what I understand in terms of how the taxes will increase for me. The second piece for me, Morris, you said something about legacy properties that were, there was only one in the agricultural resource protection zone that was there before the existing laws were in place, which I believe you said means that everyone who has purchased property since then bought that property knowing full well that they could not subdivide and that they could not build on it unless they met a certain criteria. So my question is, for the very, very small number of folks who are driving this proposal, why is it that they continued to buy property in the Ag RP zone, in the hundreds of acres, continued to buy more property when they couldn't even build their own primary residence on their original Ag RP property? They complained about that for years, yet continued to buy more property, knowing full well that they couldn't do that. And now they are pushing and pushing and pushing for this, really all under the guise of there's no hiding it. This is for development. This is a proposal for development. It is not for the small farmers who already exist. It's not for the small farmers who might come.
Thank you for your input.
Thank you. I appreciate you giving us the time.
And I would agree that I feel like the purpose for these discussions, I mean, we know that it began a couple years ago. There were some discussions, and then this really kind of came into full force with the ad hoc committee, ad hoc group back in September. And it always feels like this purpose is a little unclear. Is it to bring in, new smaller farms? Well, I thought that it was to, help with the non-conforming lots, and that was a primary purpose. But now we're discussing subdividing, and that doesn't really feel like, dealing with the non-conforming lots that are already existing. And I think that's why the purpose of this ordinance is so important, and making sure that the content of the ordinance matches the purpose, because we don't want to drive out our existing farmers. They are an important part of the community. And while, yes, we do want to support growth of small agriculture, we don't want to do that at the expense of people who are already working in this zone.
Well said.
So again, thank you for your public comment. If there's no more public comment, we can keep moving forward. On the specifics, I don't think I had anything about new language. So if anyone had anything about new language, I'd like you to contribute that. I had some stuff on, I think, existing stuff that seemed a little out of place that I needed clarification on, but
Was this in the definition section?
Definition or ordinance. I think I was kind of looking back to the ordinance language, but if you had something in the definition, that would be fine.
Well, while we're on the definition, I mean, they talk about verification, because again, I don't want to rewrite this. I'm just going to comment on the way it's written. So, verification of the above may be completed by a mutually agreed third party. While we're still talking about this $1,000 investment, all that stuff, and how do you define that? A, B, C, or D, blah, blah. Okay, so verification. We can't even manage that right now. So we're not managing the 50% and verifying that. Again, we've talked about that several times tonight. How the heck and who is going to do that? I mean, I don't understand, and
it's all so
should that be
contingent
defined
upon
on exactly who's going to verify? Like,
who's going to verify, and third party. Would that necessarily be whatever newly Agriculture and Resource Commission, we establish, or does that have to be a like a lawyer or
Right.
you know, a financial advisor who's
Compliance officer.
who's
that-
determining
I know,
this.
right?
And we always come back to enforcement being such an issue, which is why we need to wait until there is at least some kind of body that will provide official recommendations. You know, whether it's an ag commission, ag and resource protection commission, which will be I think we've all concurred, our final feedback will be, here's some specifics that we had, which lead us to our recommendation of establishing this and waiting to change the ordinance until then. But yeah, enforcement will definitely be one of those key points
So that's
that
a
we
huge
address.
paragraph anyway that they tried to put at the end. So it's A, B, C, or D,
Mhm.
or verification. I just think, I don't know where that's going. I see that should probably just be taken out. It's not being enforced now. It's not going to be enforced then. If the intent is not currently there, then where is the intent? And then who would that person be? Is that going to be the compliance? Or is that going to be, you know, the ag advisory board? Or is that going to be the planning? I mean, like, I don't know. Even if it's defined, I think at this point is irrelevant. The real thing is we're not doing that now. So how do we manage that and verify that, and who? And then I guess going back to Maurice, a farmer, also called an agricultural, how they tried to define this over and over. The weird, like this last sentence really strikes me like, I don't even know why they included it. It says, however, in the not so distant past. It's like they're putting a little bit of history in here. So I see where we're putting the history so that we can document, so that generations from now know how we got to this point. But why is that in the ordinance? I've
Yeah,
never
it's a-
seen an
it's a very
ordinance
strange
written
place.
where
It's almost
start a story.
Like, yeah, it's story-like,
not
and
so
it
distant
doesn't
past,
belong.
however, the
Wait,
definition of a farmer was.
Well, like what?
and
Maybe that could be
Why is
something
that
that
in
would
there?
be in the charter documents for a commission, but it doesn't belong in the definition of an ordinance doing a story time. I agree that having that
Yeah.
context is important, but yes, the placement's
Well,
very.
yeah, even if you want to put in the context, I could see that being useful if it was specific. You know, if it said up until 1988, our definition of a farmer was the following, but in the not so distant past, I mean, that could be 50 years or, you know, 5, depending on who you ask. So.
The gentleman that drafted that language essentially is one of the individuals that Michelle was.
Mhm. And then we also have something about the livestock and how they tried to define this, which I brought up in the past when this was all going through your subcommittees and stuff. Because again, how many cattle could you safely fit on a 3-acre lot after you have a house, a barn, or whatever? How many horses? How much this? So as the livestock started getting defined, and some of that was defined from the old ordinance already, so it's just carrying it forward. Has that changed and adapted? Then we have this inclusive by chapter 8 animals, you know, 1-acre land plot, whatever. So it has to follow that criteria. And then after that, other livestock that's not defined, the lot size shall be determined by the municipal officer in charge with enforcement. So again, we're not enforcing that. How are they going to enforce that? They're not an animal specific body. They're just an enforcer. How do they know what is safe housing or safe circumstances for cattle?
And
Like,
how do you
on a
prevent
lot of- and-
like certain personal opinion being influenced in that? Like you're saying,
Right,
you know, there's
right.
no real guidance on, okay, in all other cases, you know, said appointed person will decide. Well, there's really no guidance for how they're going to decide based in the definition, and there's no reference to where that might be established. So in our interpretation, it would be up to the, you know, opinion of that person, and how do you ensure that that's fair?
I think the one point that hasn't been raised that worthy of thought, that is if a young person is interested in starting a farm or coming to Auburn or here anywhere, they've got to have some certainty if they're going to commit their lives this location, sort of thing, and the farming, they've got to have some certainty that they aren't going to be listening to this constant turmoil. This is going to change. This is going to change. he or she has to be able to make with some confidence, and their plans based on more than a 5 or 10-year window.
Very
Yeah.
good point.
I agree with that, and even I would just add on to that, even beyond the people who might be thinking of starting a farm. I think it's just to have the commitment to resource preservation and to the environment sends the right message to people who would come to this area. And if we move away from that and are seen moving away from that, it could have a chilling, effect on, other people coming to this area and decide. I mean, I say that because one of the things that drew my wife and I to this area, we grew up in the Bangor area, and where sprawl is a disease. I mean, it's just the whole city has become sprawl, and they've done some good work to develop the corridor. But one of the things that attracted me to Auburn is, it's got a fairly robust center, and then the outside is protected. You can drive, 5 miles and you're in farmland. I think we should think about that because it's a really great thing about where we live.
Especially with younger generations who are going to value that conservation land in the context of climate change and urban sprawl. And while that might not necessarily be in the context of this specific ordinance, if you're hoping to bring people in for, living in Auburn, I think that's important to know what the future generations are going to consider valuable based on existing trends.
The point that Sam raises is very valid because basically that's the entire purpose of the 50% rule when it was initially put in. Basically, it was the best way with the conditions that existed at that point in time to indirectly assure that family's commitment to long-term open space or agriculture or trees or some combination. And basically, it was, from an enforcement standpoint, the city engineer planner requested how do you define a bona fide farmer, and essentially that's what the planning board suggested at that point in time was basically it captured the family.
Well, $1,000 ain't doing them justice now, because that's a
Is that a
slap in
bona
the
fide
face. And
farmer?
if I was truly a dairy farmer such as yourself, I can only imagine how your gut is spinning, saying, if you invest $1,000, then you're considered a farmer. I mean, true farming, true agriculture, a lot of $1,000 is not justifying anything at all. That's backyard garden. I spend over that in perennials.
Oh, you can almost
Then you
buy a
add some of
lawnmower.
my little
No, seriously.
veggies that I've got go. I'm not even kidding.
Oh,
The first year I had my chickens, I had to get my coop, I had to buy my food, all that. I probably spent $5,000 on that little flock.
you raise a
So
very good point.
Every
yeah.
year I probably spent close to $1,000 taking care of those chickens. That's my investment.
And
You could do that technically on here with about 10 chickens. You only have to have 10 chickens.
So I think we agree
That's
that
not agriculture.
the $1,000 limit of investment is something that we would change. And what our recommendation, again, contingent on, developing this commission first, would it be to follow state standards for income requirements, or would it just
I think
be
it's too lax.
it's too low? The proposed, Agriculture and Resource Protection Commission should address it. And not necessarily give something in its place, but say we don't agree with this and we would not approve this.
Yeah, I think that I would lean towards that rather than going with state definitions. I mean, I think Michelle had actually suggested this in the notes of the planning board meeting. The idea of having 50% and the 50% threshold for one individual in the household. I still think you run into some challenges with compliance and, how do you verify that? But, so one of the concerns I've heard about 50% for the family is that you have one person working outside the home as a carpenter, making a good living, another person running a small operation can't compete with that, or a lawyer, whatever it might be.
Right.
But if it's just 50% of that individual's income, their
The landowner,
take home,
yeah,
the
or-
landowner. I mean, I'd be interested in exploring that. I don't know that we proposed that, but I think, I'm interested in that as, a definition of a farmer, someone who's really committing a robust amount of their time and resources to farming.
That's something that we had talked about in our January meeting when we had Josie Leahy from the Natural Resource Conservation Center service at our meeting. You know, she agreed that it was way too lax, that we were swinging from one pendulum to the other side of, you know, too extreme to too lax, and that, we change little things and, maybe not change the ordinance for every little thing, but, start smaller, don't go to the exact opposite of what we have now. So I would agree that that is something that we could be open to, but at least for now, having our feedback be we don't support the $1,000 investment. It's too low.
Yeah.
The only other specific feedback I have, because I do want to try and get us out of here before bed. No, I'm kidding. But, we are kind of tapering to the end of this for specific feedback. And one thing that I made sure to write down from last meeting is this definition of street frontage. It's not defined in the definitions. Street frontage, we would encourage that it be limited to city-owned and maintained roadways, and that private roadways don't be included in the consideration of street frontage, because then there's this, how could you count the number of parcels that could be created if you made this winding private road, and now all of a sudden all these lots do meet the street frontage requirements, and it's a private road. I think that's a definition that should be added to the definitions page and also specified to be city-owned and maintained streets.
Yeah.
In terms of specific feedback, I don't know that we've gotten to page 5 of the ordinance changes and point 1 there, minimum lot area width and depth, but I see this as one of the other key issues in terms of the 10 acres versus 3. And I certainly think that it needs to be maintained at 10. And I think strong on that point. I don't know how others feel about that. But I think, for several of the reasons that have come up tonight, once you break up a 10-acre lot into 3-acre parcels, you can't get that land back. So I think there are a number of concerns with that, and also being able to diversify. If you have a small, when you have a 3-acre farm, you have less opportunity to diversify than if you have a larger lot. If your needs change. So I think that's a point.
And if you have a 10-acre lot, there's no reason why you can't use 1 or 2 acres for agriculture. Nothing tells you that you have to use 10 acres. So it still supports small farming.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And again, it's not favoring small farming.
And as Michelle said, she has 60 acres and she has a small farming opportunity. You can do intensive agriculture on a small portion of a large lot.
Yeah. And I would say, in order to accommodate existing lots where, people want to build a home, that would be, keep it at the 10 acres, but for existing non-conforming lots, have it reviewed on a case-by-case basis for the people who really do want to build a home for agricultural purposes, and maybe their lot's too small, but if it's existing, because, this is talking about creating the new lots, but I do want to try and be fair to the existing lots, and we've discussed you purchase that land knowing full well that you can develop on it, but if there is a true desire and someone wants to take the time to come to a newly established, Agriculture and Resource Protection Commission, make their case, and then have that discussed, that shows effort that they really do have a non-conforming lot, they want to have agriculture, and they want to build on it, and let's see, how many people come forward in that sense, and go case by case instead of changing it in the ordinance without knowing how many people truly need this change.
Right.
Yeah, and then possibly developing more of the watershed, like I said, and
as
backwards moves. And then Good Food Council, even they had agreed, we need to preserve these large farms. So this is not going to preserve those large farms either. People are going to subdivide and break them up. Then they won't exist anymore. Yeah. We're one of the few gems in the state of Maine that actually has some pretty decent sized farms right in an urban area.
Well, and like
that
you were getting on
exist.
The point, just the diversity of having all the benefits of a city while also having the beauty in the rural areas that you can drive through, and that you can go to a recreational and take your dog on a walk, and maybe you're, on a trail that like the LA Trails was doing, and oh, it's a snowmobile trail that goes through someone's private property, but they allow people on it. It's like, that's why I, as a young person, live here, because I have the benefits of the city and the beauty of the rural landscape that, if all these houses start popping up, who's to say that's what citizens want?
Say
As
one
Morris was
thing.
I
pointing
certainly
out
don't.
before, there are adequate small lots already in the ag zone for somebody who really wanted one. There's no need to split up a larger lot. Plenty of small ones there.
And there are people willing to farm these small, non-conforming lots and not live on them. The Smallian population, right, that we've been talking with, that some of them are already farming on acreage that they don't own. They don't have to live there. It's kind of an inconvenience, yes. Traditionally, we're used to having all this farming equipment, and I agree. I don't want to be having tractors left out there if there's no safekeeping and there's nobody watching my land. But if you're a true farmer, you're out there every day. You are driving that plot. You are working that land for the most part, with the exception of forestry kind of does its own thing with lower maintenance. But you're growing crops in the summer. I can't imagine that you're not going to be there for 5 days. I mean, who's going to water your crops?
And if
things?
you do show that commitment, bring it to an agriculture and resource
Right.
protection commission and make that case and go case by case instead of just opening this up for whoever. We don't know how many people need this. We've asked for that information. It's not been given to us. We know there's some people driving it, but we don't know who, we don't know how many, and we don't know, how many lots are going to be developed by people who want this. So I think that's information that we need to coordinate with. If the city can't do it, which I understand is a lot of time and resources, then we have Bates that's ready and willing to help, and they've done great work for us before and getting that information. But we need that. We can't just go changing the ordinance for so-called needs that we can't actually verify are a need.
And, there again, that's why if we have a fairly high standard, most anything in the ordinance, and then if there's valid recent exceptions, such as Sam mentioned, essentially, particularly with the family that has split income, then basically the commission can essentially recognize the validity of something and suggest an accommodation, but for a specific situation at a specific point in time, and not changing the whole ordinance just to accommodate an individual and create a lot of unintended consequences in the process.
Exactly. We want to accommodate the people who need this service. I'm not sure if that's maybe been lost, is that we're not opposed to accommodating and being flexible and allowing for certain circumstances, but we don't want to open up a floodgate for unintended consequences. That's just going to be shoved onto the next, cycle of government or the next generation. Oh, well, they can change the ordinance again to make it more restrictive. That's not a good approach to
And
take.
as you review this proposal, whatever, essentially, don't forget the subdivision regulation and essentially what's built in there, because basically that's for the first 5 years. The next 5 years it can be divided again. Then 5 years after that it can be divided again, and you've got a multiplicative situation where 2 goes to 4, 4 goes to 16, and
it's conflicting because in one part of the proposal, they talk about as of January 1st, 2018, meaning you have to have your lot before that. You can't subdivide after. Then it's conflicting because in another area, they talk about, wow, you can do this and you can do that, and you can keep dividing. So is it or isn't it?
and the gentleman that provided the primary draft essentially is making the argument essentially about fairness and being unfair to the average citizen, because farmers are getting an unfair advantage, and somehow forgotten in the process is that the person had to own it prior to 2018, and those afterwards who still citizens of Auburn don't have the same opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you're out of luck.
Sorry, I'm just reading.
I know, we're
Tiz's-
going back. I know, I was trying to go back. I'm looking at a couple of business things to make sure we included.
Seems to be,
I think we've covered most of it.
and I think she's basically, all of her comments have been addressed in our comments. And I think we've made really good progress tonight. I don't want to get too spiraling out of control. I think we discussed a lot of really good, fine detail feedback. I think we have a plan on how we want to present that feedback. You know, I'll come prepared with a draft for the next meeting in June, and then we can vote on that, and then I will submit that saying, here are some specifics that led us to our decision and recommending that a commission be established prior to any changes taking effect. So if everyone's okay, I'd like to leave this topic for tonight.
Right. And just one, hopefully, you and basically any other commission can search for independent documentation as to why we should have more, why it's good business for the city of Auburn to have more housing built in the rural area. Basically, there's arguments, emotional arguments. I have yet to see a single piece of independent information which would support that on a dollars and cents basis. There are loads of it
Against.
that can oppose it.
I will consider that. Thank you. I'll look for it. Can't guarantee anything, but I'll do my best.
But you know, because we're committed to fact-based decision making.
Exactly.
We don't have supporting facts why we should.
Why we should change it. Exactly. So the last thing is annual report. I guess I will try and create a draft. Rihanna, if you would mind doing a section for Community Forest Board, that would be super helpful. And Maurice, you've done a really good job of sending me stuff from the MAGIRP process that you did. So I will type up a section. If you can review it and let me know if there's anything missing, that would be helpful. And then Ben, I know this is your last meeting, but if before you leave, you could summarize what you've done with LA Trails for the annual report, that would be super helpful. Thank you. And on that note, this is Ben's last meeting.
Come to one more.
I don't know. I hear he's pretty busy, but maybe
So
we'll have
this
to go to him.
It's going to be our annual report that we're reporting back to council to let council know what we've accomplished
Yes, and last
Okay.
year I
from
don't.
June to June, right?
Yes, and I'm gonna submit last year's because I don't think there was ever a finalized version, but it was a really good draft, and I just want to make sure that we have it on record because we did do one, but it was never finally. There was voted to be approved with some changes, but I'm gonna submit it as is because it was approved, but there were some additions to Forest Board that were needed. But I thought it was pretty comprehensive, so I'll come with a draft for the June meeting with the annual report, and we can vote on it, and then we can submit it from June 2018 to this June. Well, yeah. I
Should
guess.
have some park stuff. connected now
I'll
because
see if
it's June
Tiz
to
can
June.
send some. So on that note, I'm gonna make a motion to adjourn.
I'm going to second that motion.
Okay, all in favor? Wonderful, thank you. And can we get a round of applause for Ben on his
I
last?
know,
Thank
right?
you. I'd apologize.
We said we should have brought you a cake.
I
We felt
know.
like we're congratulating and saying goodbye all at the same time because busy camper.
Yeah.
Go have a celebration.
Yes. Well.